At the moment, there are a lot of different war zones around the world, particularly across the Middle East, Ukraine and Africa, and as you might imagine, these don't always stick to ground level.
We will join our allies in closing off American airspace to all Russian flights.
When these conflicts start to expand upwards into the airspace above, well, then they can have a big impact on aviation, which can come in the form of reroutes, lack of ATC services, security concerns, lack of parts for aircraft that need to divert, and much more. But it can also directly threaten the safety of the aircraft who are overflying these areas. Back in 2014, this risk was highlighted in the most tragic way imaginable when Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 was shot down over Ukrainian airspace, killing all 283 passengers and 15 crew on board. And even more recently, back in 2020, Ukrainian Airlines Flight 752 was misidentified by Iranian air defense systems after departure from Tehran International and was also shot down, killing all 176 people on board. So, in a more and more unstable world, what is being done to make sure that this cannot happen again? Stay tuned. The biggest conflict currently impacting commercial aviation is Russia's invasion into its neighbor Ukraine. The reason this particular conflict has such a massive impact is because it has led to the closure of a huge chunk of airspace in direct connection to the fighting, but also to certain airlines of most of Russia as part of Russia's reaction to the economical sanctions levied against them. When large swaths of airspace is being closed or restricted, this obviously leads to huge costs for the aviation industry. Longer routes mean longer flying times and more fuel burned, equaling higher carbon emissions and overall higher costs, which is then passed down to the passengers in the form of higher ticket prices. In the case of Russia's war on Ukraine, this conflict primarily took out a big swath of airspace used for routings between Europe and the Middle East and Asia. But even though the cost of having to fly around is high, it's nowhere near as high as the potential cost associated with the risk of flying through an active war zone, with its frequent airstrikes, missiles and other ballistic weapons. So obviously, there always has to be a balance between the increased cost versus avoiding these increased risks. And in this case, the industry always acts on the side of caution. With Ukraine's airspace closure and sanctions preventing many nations' aircraft from heading through Russia and Belarus, that immediate risk is effectively mitigated. But that doesn't mean that all risks to commercial aviation stemming from these conflicts has disappeared. Instead, as you can see in this recent report, tensions between Belarus and Ukraine over airspace violations just highlight the risks that commercial aviation continues to face. And by the way, it's exactly in moments like this that I turn to Ground News, today's sponsor and my go-to source for seeing the full story from every angle. Ground News is a platform that pulls together news from all over the world and puts it all together in one place so we can see how different outlets are covering the same story. And you can check them out at ground.news/mentornow. For this story in particular, more than 20 articles are published on it, including from sources on the ground in Russia and Ukraine, giving it a well-rounded perspective of what's going on. Comparing coverage like this is interesting. Censor.net questions Belarus's motives for claiming to shoot down Ukrainian drones, while the Straits Times piece instead emphasizes Belarus's diplomatic demands for Ukraine to address airspace violations. Without getting access to these different perspectives, I would not be able to form a complete picture of what's going on, and it's lovely to be able to navigate the spin. Ground News gives more insight on any topic than a single article ever could, and you guys have made it pretty clear how frustrating the lack of context and the abundance of sensationalism in mainstream media can be, so I can't recommend it enough. Now, scan this QR code or go to ground.news/mentornow to subscribe. My viewers save 50% of unlimited access to the Vantage plan, the same I use. Make sure to use my link to get the biggest discount of the year, whether you want to subscribe for yourself or gift it to someone you know. They are subscriber funded, so by subscribing you're not only supporting my work directly, you're also helping to bring transparency to the information that we all consume. Thank you, Ground News. Now back to the story. With any type of conflict comes something known as secondary risks. Things like the possibility of air traffic conflicts due to the airspace being more congested in areas where all of the diverted traffic now has to pass through, or just a general lack of air traffic control infrastructure. And that was actually one of the main problems in Afghanistan after the US handover back to the Taliban. But one thing that is really worth planning for is something known as spillover risk. This is when a conflict expands beyond its original boundaries, and one of the ways that this can happen is when, for example, certain type of weapons malfunction. This is exactly what happened in November of 2022 when a Ukrainian air defense missile strayed away from its target and impacted a village near the border in Poland. And that wasn't even the first time something like that had happened in the Russia conflict. In March of 2022, a Soviet-made Tupolev Tu-141 reconnaissance UAV also crashed in Zagreb, nowhere near where it was supposed to be. So the problem with even the most advanced weapons is they don't always end up where they are meant to. They can lose guidance signals and with that their navigation abilities, which could then start them heading off towards an unintended target. And that of course sounds quite a bit worrying when you consider just how many of these weapons that are out there and being used right now. So how high is the risk to civilian aircraft in reality then? Are we in danger anytime that we fly even close to the borders of these known conflict zones? Well, since the shootdown of MH17, the way conflict zone risks have been assessed and mitigated against has been thoroughly looked into. And not just that, but things like how risk information is being shared and the responsibilities of the states and operators involved has also been massively redefined. And all of this came from the recommendations in the MH17 final report. After that horrible accident, it fell on the Dutch safety board to carry out a difficult and harrowing task of asking why and how MH17 could get caught in the conflict, and what they discovered was quite alarming. It turns out that when MH17 flew over the Donetsk region at flight level 330, the crew actually thought that they were safe from any risks. And that was because before the flight, when the pilots had read through the NOTAMs, notices to air missions, which should have made it clear what flight levels were safe or not, these NOTAMs had been really confusing, messy and also contained completely contradictory information. But based on those, the crew of MH17 had assumed that at flight level 330 they would be safe, which it obviously ended up not being. Now, one of the reasons for this lack of comprehensive risk assessment information was that two different air navigation service providers were effectively battling for control over the airspace that MH17 were going to fly through, and neither of those were making sure that effective or accurate information was getting through to those who actually needed it, the airlines and their pilots. Even the states involved weren't sharing information on the situation back then, at least not as well as they should be. And the final report suggested that Ukraine should really have closed the airspace entirely, particularly after they had found out that armed militant groups had access to surface-to-air missiles and other anti-aircraft weapons. But as we know, that decision was never taken, and a lot of the information that should have led to better risk assessment was not widely known. Like the fact that just days before the tragedy, an Antonov AN-26 and a Sukhoi Su-25 had both been shot down over that same part of eastern Ukraine, impacted by powerful weapon systems which had the capability to easily reach 33,000 feet and even higher. But since none of that information had been made public, it meant that on July the 17th, at around 16:19 local time, MH17, along with 3 other commercial aircraft, were all operating in this area. And in fact, Singapore Airlines Flight 851 was just 33 kilometers away when MH17 was shot down. It later turned out that a total of some 900 flights from 37 different airlines had operated through this region in the days leading up to the tragedy. Now, that's really horrifying. So what is being done about it then? Well, according to EASA, the Civil Aviation Authority in Europe, there are currently 11 conflict regions which operators need to be aware of. And when I say that they need to be aware of it, it means that these regions are considered so dangerous that they have actual flight restrictions imposed on them. EASA now share this information through conflict zone information bulletins, which contains all of the relevant information and restrictions pulled together from intelligence gathered by different EASA states, plus the UK and the United States. These bulletins contain information about the current situation, its background, as well as the real risk levels. And they make recommendations about what precautions operators should take if they're thinking about flying through these regions. Plus, it helps them carry out their own risk assessments on whether they actually should fly through these areas or not. Some of these recommendations contain minimum flight levels and others are mandatory prohibitions, in other words, no-fly zones. And right now, these no-fly zones includes the airspace over Yemen, Syria, Libya, Ukraine and Sudan. But there is one area which until very recently has been fairly conspicuously missing from that list, and that's Israel. Now, I say until very recently because this actually changed after we had planned to film this video. During the last weeks of September of 2024, Israel launched an attack on Lebanon, which on the 29th of September caused the EASA to reissue a bulletin for Israeli airspace, basically saying that it's now considered very dangerous to fly there. So before we go into the most recent situation, let's take a look at what happened in the lead up to that situation and why Israel has been considered reasonably safe, even though it's been embroiled in conflict for decades at this point. The Israel-Gaza conflict is currently one of the most active conflicts in the world, with hundreds of projectile weapons available to both sides. Israel's capital city, Tel Aviv, is regularly targeted by several different militant groups, and the international airport, Ben Gurion, lies very close to all of these target areas. Aside from rockets and missiles, there are also weaponized drones, generally high levels of military activity, airstrikes and air defense systems to worry about. So how has that been mitigated? Well, Israel has an exceedingly advanced air defense system, known to most as the Iron Dome. And this system, which is used to protect against short-range rockets, is actually only one part of the multi-layered defense systems that Israel use. So what is this system and how does it work? Well, the Iron Dome protects against short-range projectiles and low-tech rockets from a distance of around 70 kilometers or so. It forms a sort of inner ring within the complete system, providing a final shield for the city below, and during the current conflict, so far, it has intercepted thousands of projectiles with a success rate of over 90%. Now, a big part of how it's been that successful is its ability to see what incoming objects are actually a threat and to disregard those who aren't. Its radar and interception systems can handle a huge number of targets simultaneously, around 20 per 10 seconds or so, and when a threat is spotted, it is tracked and the impact point is closely calculated. The battle management control system then fires missiles to take down only those predicted to land within the protected area. So this system in itself does not pose a threat to civilian air traffic. Now, each missile from the Iron Dome costs around $50,000, which is actually relatively cheap when compared to the other multi-million-dollar systems that also make up part of the defense. This includes things like David's Sling, who provides multi-level protection and can engage mid-range threats from 100 to 200 kilometers away, as well as hostile aircraft, drones and missiles. Beyond that, protecting against really long-range threats, Israel uses the Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 system, who can track threats heading from several thousand miles away and even destroy these threats while they're still in space. So with all of these systems in place and obviously very active, why are we still seeing civilian aircraft operate into this area? What is protecting them from misidentification, and why was Israel's airspace not included in that no-fly zone list before? Well, as it turns out, there are actually some good reasons for that. First up, any commercial aircraft is required to have a transponder on board, assigned with a 4-digit code which becomes its identifier. When this transponder is interrogated, it then sends out a response signal which clearly shows which aircraft it is and what its intentions are. This works for air traffic control radars, helping to separate different aircraft, but importantly, it also works for military radars. On top of this very basic way of identifying civilian airliners, the air defense systems can also track all aircraft in its airspace and easily determine the difference between an aircraft flying happily at 36,000 feet at Mach 0.84, versus the signature of an incoming missile. Both MH17 and Ukrainian Airlines Flight 1752 were shot down by manually controlled systems. In other words, they were misidentified by the humans controlling them. But Israel's air defense systems have multiple protections built into it, specifically to prevent that kind of misidentification, and the training of their systems operators is extremely good. Now, that should sound comforting, but whilst fighting is taking place between Israel and its foes, what's stopping civilian aircraft from getting caught in the crossfire? Well, all states are required to provide information regarding their air defense systems and mitigations they have in place to prevent against misidentification. And this is something that Israel takes very seriously and also does quite well. They have multiple contingency plans in place and can make rapid tactical adjustments to different bits of airspace if the threat levels increase, and they also hold themselves highly accountable for ensuring the safety of all civilian operators. This means that they will close airports, airspace, or issue warnings and guidance proactively to ensure no one is caught in the region when attacks are expected. They reckon that their alert systems function to a 99% level of accuracy and provide several hours of advance warnings, ensuring they can get aircraft out quickly and not have anyone stuck in Tel Aviv during high-intensity attacks. In order to protect against random attacks, Israel have also published specific routes for commercial aircraft designed to keep them clear of primary conflict areas and making sure that they maintain high altitudes until clear of most threats. For arrivals, the standard routing bring aircraft in via a point called Ivona, just off Israel's coast at 9,000 feet. The aircraft then maintain this altitude for 19 miles before descending to 4,000 feet in order to commence the approach. And departures follow a similar routing, where they climb close to the airport before heading out towards the coast. But, like I said before, this feeling of security and control changed very dramatically at the start of October when Iran retaliated against Israel by launching hundreds of missiles towards the Israeli territory. When that happened, EASA immediately issued a new bulletin recommending flights to avoid the airspace at all levels, referring to the extremely volatile nature of the situation and the weapons that both sides had available to them. EASA is now stating that they are closely monitoring the situation and will update their guidance accordingly. A great indication of just how quickly the international aviation community are now responding to escalating situations. Along with the Israel bulletin, EASA also reissued a similar one for Iran's airspace, recommending no operations there either, and the same goes for Lebanon. But the problem with the Iranian attack on October 1st of 2024 was that it was a completely unannounced attack. And this meant that a number of scheduled flights were still operating into Israel and over their airspace, as well as on the major north-south routings through Iran and Iraq, linking Europe to the Middle East when those missiles started flying. Now, when the attack started, Israel immediately closed their airspace, and any aircraft routing close to Israel were therefore diverted around it, mostly to the western side over Egypt. Remember, Syria is also on a no-fly zone for nearly all operators, and Jordan's airspace lies on the wrong side of Israel, between them and Iran. Fortunately, there was still time to do all of these diversions because the Israeli defense system gave a little bit of a warning time. But what there was not enough time to initially do was to also completely clear Iranian and Iraqi airspace. And this meant that multiple aircraft were still in that region when the missiles were being launched. Now, aircraft that were flying close to boundaries were mostly rerouted back around to their original airports or forced to divert into neighboring safe countries such as Turkey, Egypt and Greece, for example. And this was again a great example of how the aviation safety system are supposed to react when faced with a sudden war threat. The plan is always to try and get civilian aircraft out of danger as quickly as possible. And this is done by forcing them to leave high-risk airspace, like they did here, and then generally land at the nearest suitable airport to ensure that they don't run into any fuel issues. So the events of October 1st ultimately led to over 80 diversions, affecting 16 airlines and 26 different airports. And again, this was all done to minimize the risk of commercial aircraft being targeted by missiles by mistake. Now, when we're on the subject of civilian missile defenses, Did you know that 20 years ago, El Al Israeli Airlines became the first commercial operator to equip their aircraft with anti-missile systems? You see, back in 2002, an Arkia Israeli Airlines Boeing 757 was targeted by man-portable air defense systems, also known as MANPADS, as it was taking off from Kenya's Moi International Airport in Mombasa. Two shoulder-launched Strela 2 surface-to-air missiles were fired toward flight EZ-582 as they climbed through about 500 feet, and they narrowly missed the aircraft. So narrowly, in fact, that the turbulence from the missiles, who passed less than a meter away from one of the wings, actually led the pilots to believe that they had had a bird strike. Following this, in 2004, El Al installed anti-missile systems on all of their aircraft using technology developed by the Israeli Air Force Flight Guard. This includes an onboard radar system that can detect incoming missiles and uses Doppler radar to work out the object's velocity. If you look at an El Al aircraft, you can actually see some additional antennae installed on it. One in the front, one on either side, and a rear antenna, who together gives the radar 360 degrees of coverage. If this radar detects an incoming missile, the system will start to eject flares, so work as an aerial infrared countermeasure to deflect missiles away from the aircraft by confusing their heat-seeking ability. Now, this system won't stop satellite or radar-guided missiles though, but the likelihood of intentional targeting by these type of systems have been judged as pretty low. But on the other hand, if we go back in history, it turns out that the MANPADS actually are one of the biggest threats to commercial aircraft in war zones, likely just because of how easily accessible they are. Since 1975, more than 60 civilian aircraft have been hit by these type of weapons, causing 28 accidents and over 1,000 deaths in total. Now, the reason other airlines don't install systems like El Al has comes down to one simple consideration: cost versus actual risk levels. In the case of El Al, they have identified a very specific threat against them, but other airlines have found it easier and cheaper to just remain at flight levels high enough to stay clear of the risk of MANPADS. And that is why the majority of conflict zone bulletins restricts flights below 26,000 feet, which is the average maximum altitude for known MANPAD types. But that of course raises the question of what an aircraft would do if they would need to descend below that level because of, for example, engine issues or a rapid depressurization. Well, in those cases things become very complicated quickly, because it's unlikely that the crew would want to divert into a war zone country unless it is really an absolute emergency. Instead, the pilots would likely try to reroute out of the airspace as rapidly as possible, which is yet another reason to stay clear of these zones altogether. So to recap on the situation in the Middle East specifically, while Israel's own air defense systems are not deemed a risk, their mitigation plans are considered robust and they are good at sharing information. The situation in the region is now so volatile that it does warrant a no-fly zone. And on top of what I've already explained, there are also a couple of other things to take into consideration here. One big point is that the Israel-Hamas conflict has now expanded well beyond its initial borders and is no longer confined to just Israel and the areas where Hamas operates. Now, much of the Middle Eastern region is very volatile right now, with a lot of political unrest and conflicts between neighboring countries, many of which have weighed in on this current conflict. Now, this isn't intended as a narrative on the conflicts occurring in the region or a political analysis of it, but it is worth understanding who else is involved because it paints a clearer picture of what areas might become a problem for aviation going forward. Iran's involvement in this and in other conflicts, including the Syrian war, means that the risks now spreads as far as Iraq and Iran to the east and Lebanon to the west. The Syrian war has also spread to Turkey as they attempt to protect their southern borders. And the Yemen war, which Saudi Arabia has been deeply involved in, impacts the southern area of Saudi. But more recently, threats have also spread up through the Red Sea as Houthi rebels supporting Iran have been showing their support by targeting Israel. With so many different actors involved, assessing the true risk in the area is becoming increasingly difficult, especially when you start to consider smaller factions and the type of weaponry that they might have. So expect further restrictions and delays around this area unless things calm down very soon. But don't worry, Like I mentioned before, the international aviation community is always operating by the principle better safe than sorry, which means that any airspace where there's an unknown level of threat is normally just sealed off. So in terms of actual danger for passengers flying, I wouldn't judge them as any higher than usual. But what I have talked about so far doesn't include one of the biggest issues to commercial flights at the moment: GPS interference. This is undoubtedly one of the largest challenges commercial aviation is currently facing, since it has such a massive potential impact on aircraft navigation and communication capabilities. GPS interference in different forms has been a common side effect of conflict zones for years, and it's currently very widespread across the Middle East, as well as in Ukraine, Belarus and parts of Russia and Scandinavia. Now, I have covered this in detail in one of my previous videos, but here comes a little summary. GPS interference is used by the military and other fighting forces in order to block or mimic real GPS signals. This can jam communications and help send guided weapons off target, but the problem is it doesn't differentiate between civilian traffic using GPS and military actors. It basically just jams or spoofs anything within a certain radius from the transmitter that's causing it. This means that if an aircraft flies through or even close to an area where active GPS interference is in place, well, then its navigational equipment will also be affected. GPS jamming can degrade and even render navigation and communication systems who need GPS unusable, and this can impact an aircraft's ability to fly certain type of approaches, and it can even mean that they are no longer able to use certain airspace, like over the North Atlantic, which has reduced separation requirements and therefore needs aircraft to have very accurate levels of navigation. On top of that, it can also mess up certain internal systems who require GPS time to function, but the biggest problem is definitely GPS spoofing. You see, instead of completely jamming the GPS signals, spoofing actually sends out false signals, leading any GPS system who picks them up to think that the time and position contained in those signals are actually accurate. This can have some very serious results for aircraft, since it doesn't just degrade the navigational systems, it actually makes the aircraft think that it is somewhere else where it's not. Now, if the pilots pick this up, they will have to resort to basic navigation modes, which sometimes are less accurate, and this is often happening in areas where navigation accuracy is really needed due to the terrain risks and unsafe airspaces around. Spoofing also sometimes messes with the aircraft's enhanced ground proximity warning system, which helps prevent the aircraft from heading into terrain. This system works by comparing the aircraft's predicted trajectory using its GPS position with an internal terrain database, and spoofing not only confuses the system regarding where it is laterally, but can also spoof it with incorrect vertical positions. This basically causes the aircraft to not have any kind of idea where it is, which obviously can lead to both incorrect warnings or a lack of warnings when they are really needed. Now, GPS interference areas are also monitored by EASA, and currently there are big problems across the Middle East, particularly in Iran and Iraq, as well as obviously around Israel. Since the Ukraine war started, the Baltic regions have also seen a big increase in these type of issues, particularly around the coast of Finland and Sweden, as well as the Black Sea region and adjacent countries, and even as far north up as the Arctic region. So this is a big and widespread problem, and it is turning into one of the biggest risks for commercial aircraft when operating near conflict zones. But the good news is that we, the pilots, are well aware of this, and it is perfectly possible to revert to other types of navigation once jamming and spoofing is identified. Also, since the MH17 shootdown, there has been a massive improvement in how threat information is gathered and shared, as well as in how risk assessments are carried out. This has greatly reduced the risks associated with conflicts, since we now know about the risks and can therefore plan for them. Now, it's important to point out that we will never be able to reach 100% safety in any industry, not even in aviation. But the point of this, and basically all of my videos, is to show you how we, as an industry, always strive to learn from the past and through that become safer every single day. But what do you think? What do you think would be the best strategy to guard against the risk of war for the civilian aviation world? Let me know in the comments here below, and make sure that you subscribe and leave a like when you're down there. Now, if you want to see these episodes ahead of everyone else and also help influence the content, consider joining my fantastic Patreon crew on patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. I hold regular Zoom hangouts with my crew where we discuss exactly these type of issues, and I hope to see you there next time. Now, watch these videos next and have an absolutely fantastic day. Bye bye.